As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Jesus answered,
Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world.
When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him,
Go, wash in the pool of Siloam.
which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask,
Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?
some were saying,
It is he.
others were saying,
No, but it is someone like him.
he kept saying,
I am the man.
but they kept asking him.
Then how were your eyes opened?
He answered,
The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. Then I went and washed and received my sight.
they said to him,
Where is he?
he said,
I do not know.
so they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them,
He put mud on my eyes. Then I washed, and now I see.
some of the Pharisees said,
This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath.
but others said,
How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?
and they were divided. So they again said to the blind man,
What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened.
he said,
He is a prophet.
the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them.
Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?
His parents answered,
We know that this is our son, and he was born blind, but we do not know how it is that he now sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age, he will speak for himself.
His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So for the second time they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him,
Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner.
he answered,
I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see.
they said to him,
What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?
he answered them,
I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?
then they reviled him, saying,
You are his disciples, but we are the disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from.
the man answered,
Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to the one who worships him in the way that he will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.
they answered him,
You were born entirely in sin, and are you trying to teach us?
and they drove him out. Jesus heard that they had driven him out, and when Jesus found him, he said,
Do you believe in the Son of Man?
he answered,
And who is he, sir? Tell me, so that I may believe in him.
Jesus said to him,
You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he.
he said,
Lord, I believe.
and he worshipped him. Jesus said,
I came into this world for judgment, so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind.
some of the Pharisees near him heard this and said to him,
Surely we are not blind, are we?
Jesus said to them,
If you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now that you say we see, your sin remains.
the gospel of the Lord. And everybody helps to read the gospel like that. I have more voice left over for longer sermons. So, have you ever heard or maybe said yourself, I don't see it. I just don't see it. Perhaps when you say that, or when it's been said to you, I don't see it, means literally you do not physically see something or you don't see a difference. There are times when people have said to me, look at this, look how this picture, the detail is so different. And I'm like, no, I don't see it, because I miss stuff like that. I just physically don't see the difference. That's what I mean when I say I don't see it. But sometimes when I say I don't see it, it means intellectually, I don't buy that argument. Yeah, I know somebody is making this argument about something, but I don't see how that makes sense. I don't buy that. I just don't see it. And sometimes when I say I don't see it, it means that emotionally, I just don't grasp how somebody could get all upset and excited about this. Or I don't understand how somebody could not get upset and excited about this. I mean, doesn't this outrage me? Why can it not? I don't see it, how it can't make everybody else upset. Seeing can mean much more than what you do physically with your eyes. And this is the case in this very long gospel reading that we just read. Today, John has given us another very long story that on its surface seems to be about Jesus healing a man born blind, and indeed it is, but it's much more than that. If John had just wanted to tell us a miracle story about Jesus healing someone, he could have done that in 12 verses like all the other evangelists instead of going on for 41. But in fact, this story is about a whole bunch of other people who also don't see, even if they're physically able to use their eyes. Jesus makes God's works known in their midst, but they don't see it. And they don't see it for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they don't see it because they aren't paying attention. Just before this story begins, Jesus has again so ticked off people up on the Temple Mount that they picked up stones and were about to stone him. And so Jesus and his disciples beat feet and left the Temple Mount and were heading down the long hill and the main road towards the Pool of Siloam, which we hear about later on. This is a place where a lot of people came and went every day because it was the main drag in and out of the temple. And it's probably why this blind man was sitting there begging, because he knew lots of people would be walking by. He was a regular fixture. But when he starts running around telling people that he can see, lots of the neighbors debate whether it's actually the same guy or just somebody who maybe kind of sort of looks like him. And probably they did that because they never really paid attention to him or to a lot of the other people or things that were on that main drag, that street. You know, they were busy coming and going, and yeah, there were people over there. It was just part of the regular kind of scenery of life, and they weren't paying attention. And so if and when God did something with or through those people or those things, they never noticed that either. They just don't see it. Some people don't see it because they do not want to deal with more drama in their lives. And after all, probably everybody's always had plenty of drama to deal with in their lives already, and they don't want to have more. One of our council presidents one time said to me, said, "Oh, how I hate drama when it's not in the theater." And I often hate drama when it's not in the theater too. I don't want more. So people want God, and they want God's works, but they want them to take away the drama, not give them more. And in this story, the parents realize that if they really see God's works going through Jesus, it's going to cause more drama. John makes this parenthetical comment about an internal family fight between Jewish Christians and Jews who were not Christians that was going on at the end of the first century when John wrote this. And he's like, oh, they had already decided. Well, I don't know if they had already decided or not, but at the time John wrote this down, there was great internal drama within the Jewish community about whether Jesus was the Messiah or he was not. And this caused a great family fight within the Jewish community. And it caused fights within individual families too. If somebody said, yes, I believe Jesus is the Messiah, sometimes people were thrown out of their families. It was causing drama. And ain't nobody wanted drama. And so the parents say, I don't know. You ask him. He's of age. I want to stay out of this because I don't want more drama in my life. And so they don't see it. And sometimes People don't see it because it just doesn't fit with their worldview. And I get that too. I want God's works to fit nicely with my life and with my worldview also. But many of the Pharisees cannot see it because Jesus has already been irritating them. It's helpful to remember that in John's Gospel, the cleansing of the temple, where Jesus goes in and literally upsets the apple cart and knocks everything over and causes all kinds of havoc and ruckus, that happens as the very first thing Jesus does in John's Gospel. It's not the last thing he does right before Holy Week. And from that moment on in John's Gospel, the Pharisees and other leaders are watching him, and every time he does or says something that just doesn't seem right, they are more and more resistant to believing that God's works could be done through him. And so, it doesn't matter what he does, they just aren't going to see it. And so their worldview and their intellectual expectations often prevent them from seeing God's works if they're done by Jesus. And so John tells this long, long story, not simply to tell us about a miracle that Jesus did. Rather, I think he makes this story, and he tells it so long this way, as a way of asking his readers, all of us, to consider what gets in our way of seeing the works of God in our life. Because it's easy to read an ancient story from long ago about people we have never met and to judge them for being so blind. But that would be to entirely miss the point of this story. Rather, John lifts up this story to get us to consider the reasons that we might miss the works of God going on around us, and how we can be more open to having our eyes opened to the works of God in our own midst. And sometimes for us too, that often means opening ourselves up to God's works in our lives by paying more attention to the regular people and places we live each day. Even though the neighbors lived in Jerusalem, this was the place where everybody came to experience the presence of God because the temple was there. They probably figured that the real action, and if God was really going to do something, it was going to happen up there on the Temple Mount. It wasn't going to happen down here in the street, right? And so they weren't open to looking around at the regular places and people that they lived among each and every day. And I think that sometimes, as we live in the D.C. area, that's really easy for us to do also. We hear about international and national traumas and intrigue and stuff like that as though it were national news. And we figure that the stuff that we hear about and we think is the really important stuff must be going on in Capitol Hill or someplace like that and all the drama and trauma, but not as we're driving on 355 down through Rockville. But that's sort of what happened in this story. It was the regular people who were there every day, who just weren't noticed. And sometimes for us too, if we're looking for what God is doing in our lives, it means paying more attention to what's happening immediately around us. Because sometimes then, too, we're going to see the works of God in our life. For us, too, sometimes seeing the works of God in our lives means being willing to accept that sometimes God's work is going to cause us more stress and discomfort and even drama in our lives. Everybody usually loves today's psalm, about how it talks about God leading us beside still waters and God's our shepherd and all that kind of stuff. But the context of that psalm, as we read it, is that people are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, that they are surrounded by their enemies. Apparently, the psalmist realizes that to experience the comforting work of God, you've got to be willing to be in emotionally difficult places. The parents in today's gospel reading call us to realize that sometimes we may miss the works of God because we resist going down the road, either physically, emotionally, or intellectually, that may cause drama and difficulty in our lives, that may make us uncomfortable. But not going down that road sometimes also means that we will miss out on the works of God going on around us. And for us too, seeing the works of God in our lives sometimes means being willing to let God mess with our expectations, with the way things are supposed to be done. Part of the irony of today's story is that the Pharisees, as a group, recognize that Jesus is doing works that look like the works of God. To cure the man born of blindness, he literally brought light from darkness. This is what God does at the very beginning of creation. This is the work of God, to bring light from darkness. But see, Jesus isn't doing them, as far as they're concerned, in the right way. And because it's not the right way, they don't see. And that story is told because sometimes we too, at least I know I do, I get hung up on like, this is not the right way to do this. This is not the proper way, and therefore it can't be God's way. But in today's story, Jesus challenges that notion and reminds us that when we get too hung up on our own worldview of the way things are supposed to be, we may miss out on the works of God in our midst. And so through this story, Jesus is also working to open our eyes so that we can see the works of God. And like those first disciples, Jesus is calling us to watch for how God's works can be made known through the ordinary people and places we walk among each day. Jesus is calling us to remember that God's works are often most intensely present when we're walking down emotionally difficult roads. And Jesus is promising us that God's works are always happening in our midst, even when they come packaged in ways that we don't expect.